Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories.
The summer of 1913 should have been a moment of celebration. After centuries under Ottoman rule, the Balkans were finally free. But within weeks, the victors turned their guns on each other, unleashing one of the most shocking betrayals in European history. Former allies became sworn enemies, secret treaties collapsed overnight, and a single miscalculation would drag four nations into a war that no one truly understood. How did a region that had just won its independence fall into a conflict so violent that entire armies were nearly wiped out in a matter of days? How did Bulgaria, the strongest military power in the Balkans, go from conqueror to cornered prey? And why did Serbia's sudden rise terrify the great empires of Europe? This is the story of the war that destroyed alliances, shattered ambitions, and turned the Balkans into the powder keg of Europe. A war whose consequences would ignite a fuse reaching all the way to Sarajevo and into the First World War itself. To understand how the world was pushed to the edge, we must begin with the moment the First Balkan War ended, and the real conflict began. On May 30th, 1913, the cannons finally fell silent. After nearly 8 months of brutal marches, hunger, and exhaustion, the First Balkan War concluded with a moment that should have marked peace: the Treaty of London. For the Balkan League, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, it was a victory that had once seemed unthinkable. They had defeated the Ottoman Empire, a dynasty that had ruled the region for 6 centuries, and forced it to withdraw almost entirely from continental Europe. The treaty redrew maps overnight. Adrianople, Edirne, one of the empire's historic centers, was lost. Thrace, Macedonia, and vast lands long held under the Crescent banner slipped away with a signature. For many in Europe, it felt like a definitive chapter closing, a century-old struggle finally resolved. But beneath the triumph, something fragile and dangerous was already forming. Because the treaty contained a flaw, one so small in words, yet enormous in consequences. It stated that the Ottomans ceded their lands not to each allied state individually, but to the Balkan League as a collective. It did not specify who would receive what. It did not draw borders, and in the Balkans, borders were not just lines on maps. They were the product of blood, memory, and generations of unresolved ambition. For a brief moment, the Allies celebrated their impossible victory. Soldiers returned home to cheering crowds, diplomats toasted a new era, and newspapers across Europe proclaimed the collapse of Ottoman Europe as a turning point in history. But the champagne had barely dried when the questions began to surface. Who would control Macedonia? Who would rule the Aegean? Who would decide which nation's dreams were honored and which nation's sacrifices had been for nothing? The war that was supposed to unite the Balkans had instead placed a feast on the table, one so rich, so disputed, that it would tear the alliance apart. The Ottoman Empire was gone from Europe. Its shadow remained only in ruins, memories, and bitterness. But in its absence, a new struggle was already taking shape, forged not between old enemies, but between former allies whose interests now collided with dangerous force. In the summer of 1913, the Balkans stood at a crossroads. They could choose diplomacy or confrontation, unity or betrayal. And as the victorious nations eyed the spoils of war, each convinced it deserved more than the treaty offered, the region braced itself for a conflict even bloodier than the one that had just ended. The First Balkan War was over, but the peace it created would last only weeks. Macedonia had always been the storm at the center of Balkan politics, a land where cultures, religions, and ambitions collided. Greeks, Bulgarians, Serbs, Albanians, Turks, Vlachs, and countless smaller communities lived side by side, each claiming a different past and a different future. To the Balkan League, this region was not just land, but identity, proof of historic rights and national destiny. And with the Ottomans driven out, Macedonia became the most valuable and most dangerous prize on the table. Before the war, Bulgaria and Serbia tried to contain this tension with a secret treaty signed on March 13, 1912. Its logic was simple: defeat the Ottomans first, argue later. Northern Macedonia would be divided, parts going to Serbia, parts to Bulgaria, and a contested middle zone left for Russia to arbitrate after victory. On paper, it was elegant, a diplomatic compromise to keep the alliance alive. But war has a way of making paper promises irrelevant. The real turning point came when the great powers insisted on creating an independent Albania. This decision severed Serbia's dream of reaching the Adriatic Sea, a dream they considered essential for their national survival. Suddenly, everything Serbia had planned for, its access to the coast, its economic future, its strategic autonomy, collapsed in an instant. In Belgrade, frustration turned into anger, and anger into a sense of betrayal. Serbian leaders argued that the pre-war treaty was based on assumptions that no longer existed. If Albania had not been created, against Serbia's will, they would have secured their path to the sea. So now, Serbia insisted, Macedonia must be revised in their favor. To them, it wasn't a violation of the treaty, it was compensation for a loss imposed by Europe. But to Bulgaria, this sounded like treachery. In Sofia, Macedonia was considered the heart of Bulgarian nationalism. It was where the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, the IMRO, had fought, bled, and dreamed of unification. To surrender more than a sliver of Macedonia was unthinkable. To watch Serbia demand more was unbearable. Every new Serbian claim felt like a stab at Bulgaria's identity and sacrifice. As diplomats issued letters and counter-letters, the mood in the Balkans grew darker. Macedonia, once seen as a shared victory, turned into a battlefield of maps, pride, and memory. Each village, each road, each valley became a question mark in negotiations, and every unresolved point became a spark waiting for fire. The First Balkan War had driven the Ottomans out. But in Macedonia, the war had left behind something far more dangerous, a region so coveted and so divided that it would pull the former allies toward a second, deadlier conflict. For Serbia, the end of the First Balkan War should have marked the realization of a national dream. Their armies had fought ferociously across Kosovo, Macedonia, and northern Albania, believing that victory would finally grant them a long-sought window to the Adriatic Sea. A coastline meant trade, security, and survival, Serbia's chance to break free from dependence on neighboring powers. But in a single diplomatic stroke, the great powers erased that promise by creating an independent Albania. In Belgrade, the news struck like a betrayal. Serbian soldiers had bled to reach the coast, only to watch European diplomats install a new state blocking their path. To the Serbian leadership, this felt not just unfair but insulting, a deliberate denial of their rightful expansion. General Putnik, Prime Minister Pasic, and the political elite concluded that if Serbia was to grow, it could only grow eastward. And that meant Macedonia. Serbia now demanded a revision of the 1912 treaty with Bulgaria. They argued that the agreement had been made under assumptions that no longer reflected reality. If Serbia could not expand west, it must expand south. More of Macedonia, they insisted, was the only reasonable compensation for the loss of their Adriatic aspirations. They framed this argument as necessity rather than aggression, but in Sofia, it felt like deceit. Bulgaria rejected the idea outright. To them, Macedonia was sacred ground, worth more than diplomatic relationships or even short-term alliances. Bulgarian leaders saw Serbia's demands not as negotiation, but as theft. They had fought side by side only months earlier. Now, Serbia's sudden claims seemed like an opportunistic grab for territory Bulgaria believed was rightfully its own. Serbian newspapers began publishing articles portraying Bulgaria as ungrateful, greedy, and unreliable. Bulgarian publications responded in kind. What had been muted rivalry during the Ottoman campaigns now erupted into public hostility. Politicians fanned the flames, military officers hardened their positions, and the people of both nations increasingly viewed conflict as inevitable. In the Serbian army, confidence soared. Victories in the First Balkan War had elevated morale to unprecedented levels. Their soldiers felt battle-tested, experienced, and ready for any challenge. They no longer feared a confrontation with Bulgaria. Some even welcomed it. Serbia had doubled in prestige and strength, and many officers believed the future belonged to them, not to Sofia. The First Balkan War had elevated Serbia from a regional player to an emerging Balkan power. But with that rise came new ambition, new resentment, and new enemies. The loss of the Adriatic did not tame Serbia, it propelled it. And the direction of that ambition pointed squarely at Bulgaria's heartland. While Serbia and Bulgaria argued over Macedonia, Greece had already secured the prize that would define the next stage of conflict, the port city of Thessaloniki. For decades, the city had been the gleaming, contested jewel of the Aegean, a crossroads of cultures, trade, and imperial ambition. Bulgarians saw it as a natural outlet to the sea. The Greeks, however, viewed it as an inseparable part of their historic identity, the legacy of Byzantium, and the foundation of their expansionist dream known as the Megali idea. When Greek forces swept into the city in 1912, just hours before Bulgarian units arrived, it was more than a military victory. It was a political statement. With the Greek flag raised over Thessaloniki, Athens believed it had secured the most important strategic point of the entire First Balkan War. And unlike other contested regions, this victory felt final. The Greek occupation was fast, coordinated, and backed by a determined naval presence in the Aegean. For Bulgaria, the loss of Thessaloniki was a humiliation as bitter as Serbia's loss of the Adriatic. Bulgarian commanders had expected to be the first to enter the city. Bulgarians in Macedonia viewed Thessaloniki as their historic port, essential to their imagined access to the Mediterranean. Watching Greece take the city, and then fortify it, stirred resentment that burned hotter with each passing week. Greece's swift control of the Aegean coast also transformed the strategic landscape. By linking their forces with Serbian units in the north, they created a continuous front that split Bulgaria's aspirations in two. Any future attempt by Bulgaria to secure Thessaloniki would require not only pushing past Greek defenses, but also confronting a now firm Serbian border. What had once been a rivalry between two states became a triangle of competing interests, each sharpened by victory. Under King George I and later Constantine I, the Greek military was confident and re-energized. The capture of Thessaloniki erased the memory of earlier defeats and established Greece as a serious military power in the region. Greek troops dug in, improved their positions, and prepared for the possibility that Bulgaria might one day try to reclaim the city. Diplomats in Athens quietly conveyed the same message to Europe. Thessaloniki was now Greek, irreversibly. As Serbia looked eastward and Bulgaria looked southward, Greece's hold on the Aegean solidified. And with each nation staking its claim, the fragile unity of the Balkan League began cracking like thin glass. Thessaloniki, once the dream of empires, had become the fault line where alliances fractured and where the seeds of the Second Balkan War were quietly sprouting. As tensions deepened across the Balkans, Serbia came to a sobering realization. It could no longer rely on Bulgaria as an ally. The dispute over Macedonia had stretched their relationship to a breaking point, and with each exchange of diplomatic notes, trust eroded a little further. Meanwhile, Greece, having secured Thessaloniki, saw Bulgaria's ambitions as a direct threat to its new gains. Two nations that once fought alongside Bulgaria now began quietly planning for a future in which Bulgaria might become the enemy. The catalyst for this shift was simple. Both Serbia and Greece understood that their survival and their territorial ambitions were now intertwined. Serbia feared losing Macedonia to Bulgaria. Greece feared losing Thessaloniki. And both feared the possibility of a lightning Bulgarian offensive that could change the map before Europe had time to react. Cooperation became less a choice and more a necessity. Behind closed doors, diplomats from Belgrade and Athens engaged in secret negotiations. The discussions unfolded quickly, fueled by urgency and a growing sense of vulnerability. What emerged from these talks was a decisive agreement. Serbia and Greece would recognize their current demarcation line as a permanent border. It was an act of defiance against Bulgaria's territorial claims and a symbolic gesture of unity between two nations previously divided by history. But the agreement did not stop there. On top of solidifying their border, the two nations signed a secret defensive alliance, one that went far beyond Bulgaria. The pact stipulated that if either Serbia or Greece were attacked, the other would immediately come to its aid. The agreement even included a clause addressing a potential threat from Austria-Hungary, revealing the depth of Serbia's fears and the complexity of Balkan geopolitics. In Sofia, the magnitude of this alliance went unnoticed at first. Bulgarian military leaders, confident in their artillery superiority and battlefield success during the First Balkan War, dismissed rumors of diplomatic maneuvering. But beneath the surface, this alliance changed everything. By forming a united front, Serbia and Greece had effectively surrounded Bulgaria's southern and western flanks, leaving it increasingly isolated. For Greece, the alliance provided reassurance that its hold on Thessaloniki was secure. For Serbia, it meant that Bulgaria could no longer use Macedonia as leverage to dominate the region. And for both nations, it signaled a dramatic shift from cooperation to confrontation, one that would soon explode into open war. What had once been the triumphant coalition of the Balkan League had quietly transformed into rival camps preparing for the inevitable clash. In Sofia, the atmosphere was dramatically different from the cautious, defensive tone in Belgrade and Athens. Bulgaria emerged from the First Balkan War, believing it had earned the right to dominate the post-war map. Its armies had carried the heaviest battles against the Ottomans, suffered the greatest losses, and won the most celebrated victories. To Bulgarian leaders, and to much of the population, the idea that Serbia or Greece might now claim Macedonia felt like a betrayal not just of diplomacy, but of destiny itself. At the center of this swelling ambition was Tsar Ferdinand. More than a monarch, he saw himself as the architect of a new Bulgarian state, one that would stretch across Thrace, Macedonia, and deep into the Aegean. His court whispered of a greater Bulgaria, a nation reborn from medieval glories, surpassing even the imagined borders of earlier centuries. For Ferdinand, the First Balkan War had not ended the struggle. It had merely opened the door to a far larger transformation. But Ferdinand's ambitions were not driven by ego alone. A powerful force pressed him from within. The Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, or IMRO. This group, made up of hardened fighters and ideologues, had spent decades battling the Ottomans for the dream of a united Macedonia under Bulgaria. They viewed any territorial compromise as an unforgivable betrayal. And their influence was not theoretical. They had assassinated before, and could do so again. IMRO leaders made their position clear. If Ferdinand accepted a partition that granted Macedonia to Serbia or Greece, they would no longer see him as Bulgaria's protector. In private meetings, threats hung unspoken but unmistakable. The Tsar, who fancied himself untouchable, understood all too well that losing Macedonian lands might mean losing his throne, or even his life. Pressure turned ambition into stubbornness, and stubbornness into fatal misjudgment. Bulgaria's military command, emboldened by earlier victories, reinforced this confidence. Generals boasted of their artillery superiority, their well-trained infantry, their battlefield discipline. They dismissed the Serbo-Greek alliance as political posturing, and believed that a swift, decisive strike could settle the dispute before the Allies had time to coordinate. In their eyes, Bulgaria was the rightful, dominant power of the Balkans. The others were obstacles, not equals. As the spring of 1913 unfolded, diplomacy eroded rapidly. Russian attempts at mediation were met with impatience in Sofia. Ferdinand and his advisors believed that negotiation only weakened their position, and that hesitation would allow enemies to consolidate their gains. What Bulgaria needed, what history demanded, was action. And the Tsar, caught between soaring ambition and pressure from IMRO, convinced himself that war was not only justified, but necessary. Thus, Bulgaria drifted toward a path from which there would be no return. Fueled by pride, fear, and the intoxicating belief in a national rebirth, its leadership prepared for a confrontation that would undo everything they had gained. The dream of a greater Bulgaria now overshadowed the fragile peace of the region, and with each passing day, the shadow grew longer. Across Europe, diplomats watched the unraveling of the Balkan alliance with growing alarm. What had begun as a united front against the Ottomans was now visibly cracking under the weight of its own victories. In St. Petersburg, foreign ministers sensed danger. Russia, which had supported the Balkan League to strengthen Slavic influence in the region, now feared its creation was slipping into self-destruction. If war erupted between the Allies, the entire balance of power in southeastern Europe could collapse. Russian officials pleaded for patience and urged Sofia to honor the pre-war agreements. They saw Bulgaria as the keystone of their Balkan strategy and believed that another conflict would jeopardize decades of diplomacy. But Russia underestimated the intensity of Bulgarian resentment and overestimated its own influence. To Bulgarian leaders, Russian mediation sounded more like pressure than support, an attempt to force them into concessions they could not justify politically or emotionally. Meanwhile, envoys shuttled between Belgrade, Athens, and Sofia, attempting to salvage what little cooperation remained. The proposals varied: joint commissions, temporary borders, arbitration courts, but none addressed the core problem. Every nation believed it had earned more than the others, and none were willing to back down. The alliance that had conquered the Ottomans found itself unable to conquer its own ambitions. In Sofia, the High Command interpreted diplomatic delays as signs of Serbian and Greek weakness. Bulgarian generals argued that negotiation only bought their rivals time to fortify positions. Every day spent debating borders was, in their eyes, a strategic setback. Their confidence remained inflated by earlier triumphs and a belief that neither Serbia nor Greece could match Bulgaria's battlefield prowess. To them, diplomacy was not a path to peace, it was a trap. Even when Russia issued increasingly stern warnings, Bulgaria's leadership bristled. Tsar Ferdinand believed the empire would never abandon Bulgaria, no matter how reckless its actions. Advisors whispered that showing hesitation would invite aggression rather than prevent it. As tensions escalated, Ferdinand convinced himself that delivering a swift military blow was the only way to resolve the crisis on Bulgarian terms. By early June, it was clear diplomacy was failing. Messages between the allies grew shorter, colder, more accusatory. The tone shifted from negotiation to suspicion, then to veiled threats. Bulgaria believed Serbia and Greece were conspiring against it. Serbia and Greece believed Bulgaria was preparing an attack. And in the middle, Russia realized it had lost control of the very alliance it had helped create. The diplomats could not stop what was coming because, by then, the war had already begun, inside the minds of the generals. Decisions were no longer being shaped by maps or treaties, but by pride, fear, and the conviction that only force could determine the future. With each passing hour, the space for compromise shrank until nothing remained but the growing certainty of conflict. The peace forged after the First Balkan War was in its final days, and as the diplomats packed their bags and the armies tightened their lines, the Balkans prepared to erupt once more, this time with allies turning their guns on each other. On the warm summer night of June 29, 1913, the Balkans held their breath, though few realized why. Along the tense front lines in Macedonia, soldiers from Serbia, Greece, and Bulgaria stared into the darkness, aware that something felt wrong, yet unable to name it. Hours earlier, officers in Sofia had received a set of secret orders from the Bulgarian High Command. These instructions bypassed civilian authorities entirely. The goal was simple: strike first, strike fast, and force Serbia and Greece to accept Bulgaria's terms before they could react. Shortly before midnight, Bulgarian artillery units opened fire. The thunder of shells shattered the uneasy quiet, raining explosions across Serbian and Greek positions. Infantry followed, advancing under the cover of darkness, bayonets fixed and hearts pounding. It was not just a surprise attack, it was an undeclared war, unleashed by a military leadership convinced that hesitation would doom Bulgaria's future. For a few hours, the Bulgarian commanders believed they had regained the initiative, but something had gone terribly wrong behind the scenes. Tsar Ferdinand, who approved the operation, had not informed his own government. Ministers awoke the next morning to the sound of gunfire and chaos, blindsided by a war they had not authorized. In panic, the civilian government issued orders to halt the offensive immediately. Those orders collided head-on with the army's momentum, causing confusion across the front. Units that had just seized ground were told to pull back, while others never received the message at all. This confusion was fatal. Serbia and Greece, though stunned by the attack, recovered quickly. Reports poured into their headquarters describing Bulgarian advances, shelling, and casualties. By dawn, both nations had concluded the same thing: Bulgaria had betrayed the alliance, and betrayal demanded a unified response. Within hours, Serbian and Greek commanders issued counter-orders, rallying their troops and preparing for full-scale retaliation. The Bulgarian High Command watched in disbelief as the operation unraveled faster than it began. What was meant to be a decisive, coordinated blitz dissolved into fragmented skirmishes and halted offensives. Any hope of delivering a crippling first strike evaporated. Instead of catching their former allies off guard, they had provoked two battle-hardened armies into action. Armies that now held the moral high ground and the advantage of defensive positions. Across Europe, the shockwave spread quickly. Diplomats scrambled to understand who had fired the first shot, why the alliance had collapsed, and whether the conflict might pull in other powers. The reality was even more dangerous. The war had started not with strategy, but with miscommunication, fear, and a czar who believed he could control fate with a midnight order. His gamble, instead, left Bulgaria exposed, isolated, and facing enemies on multiple fronts. By the morning of June 30th, the Second Balkan War was no longer a secret operation. It was a regional explosion. The guns that Bulgaria intended to use to secure Macedonia had instead ignited a conflict that would cost the nation everything it had gained. And as troops dug into new lines and prepared for the next assault, the Balkans realized that the war without warning had only just begun. Despite the chaos of the opening night attack, Bulgaria entered the Second Balkan War with the confidence of a military giant. Its leaders believed that raw force could still salvage the situation, and on paper, the Bulgarian army was terrifying. With roughly 600,000 men mobilized, battle-hardened from the First Balkan War, and armed with some of the best artillery in the region, Bulgaria stood as the most formidable military power in the Balkans. Artillery was Bulgaria's pride. They fielded an astonishing 1,116 guns, far more than any of their rivals. Against Greece, the artillery ratio was nearly 6-1. Against Serbia, 5-1. The Bulgarian General Staff believed this firepower alone could compensate for diplomatic isolation. Shells, not signatures, would decide the map. And for a nation squeezed between rivals, the superiority of their guns became both a shield and a justification for aggression. Many in the Bulgarian High Command were veterans of the wars against the Ottomans. They carried with them the memory of Edirne, Lüleburgaz, and the massive battles of Thrace, fights where Bulgarian discipline and firepower had broken the Ottoman armies. These victories had shaped their worldview. They believed that if Bulgaria struck hard and fast, Serbia and Greece would crumble just as the Ottomans had. But the generals failed to grasp one crucial difference. Serbia and Greece were no longer untested allies. They were now experienced armies with new confidence, improved tactics, and deep defensive positions. On the Serbian side, morale was sky high. Their victories in Kumanovo and Monastir had forged a battle-tested force that had already proven it could stand against Bulgaria's old enemy. The Greeks, under King Constantine I, had transformed their army during the First Balkan War, developing new logistical frameworks and improving battlefield coordination. Together, with fresh alliances and shared objectives, they were no longer nations scrambling for survival, but rivals ready for revenge. Still, the sheer size of Bulgaria's early advantage cannot be understated. Their forces occupied strong central positions in Macedonia. Their artillery was positioned on ridges and high ground. Their infantry divisions were well drilled and comparatively well supplied. In the eyes of their commanders, the war was not hopeless. In fact, they believed the initial setbacks could be quickly reversed with a concentrated offensive. Yet beneath the surface, the cracks were widening. Bulgaria was surrounded by enemies who were rapidly coordinating. Serbia had mobilized more soldiers than expected. Greece controlled the south and had the advantage of a unified command. And soon, Montenegro and even Romania would join the fray. Bulgaria's firepower was immense, but its enemies were multiplying. The Bulgarian High Command failed to see that the Second Balkan War was no longer a contest of artillery numbers. It was a contest of alliances, geography, and time. And with each passing day, Bulgaria's strategic position weakened. For now, though, they still believed in their guns. They still believed that firepower would give them victory. But on the quiet banks of the Bregalnitsa River, a storm was gathering that would test those beliefs to their breaking point. The quiet flow of the Bregalnica River stood in stark contrast to the storm that was about to break over it. Here, in the rolling hills of eastern Macedonia, the Bulgarian High Command believed it could deliver the decisive blow that would shatter Serbian resistance. Their plan rested on speed: overwhelm Serbian positions before the Serbs could fully mobilize or coordinate with the Greeks. It was a strategy born from confidence in their artillery, in their soldiers, and in their belief that Serbia was still reeling from the first night's attack. On June 30th, 1913, Bulgarian forces struck. The Fourth Army advanced in tight formation, their artillery opening a deafening bombardment that echoed for miles. Bulgarian infantry surged forward, expecting the familiar pattern of shock, collapse, and breakthrough they had witnessed against the Ottomans. But this time, they encountered something different. Serbian troops, many veterans of the First Balkan War, dug in along ridges and riverbanks with determination hardened by years of fighting. This was not an enemy caught by surprise. This was an army ready for the test. The first clashes were brutal and chaotic. Bulgarian units managed to push forward in several areas, forcing Serbian defenders to fall back under intense shelling. Smoke and dust covered the river valley as both sides fought yard by yard. But as the hours turned into days, the momentum began to shift. The Serbs refused to break. Reinforcements poured in, artillery repositioned, and commanders rallied their exhausted soldiers. What Bulgaria intended to be a swift victory transformed into a grinding battle of attrition. Between June 30th and July 9th, the fighting reached fever pitch. The heat was suffocating, the terrain punishing, and the casualties staggering. At times, hand-to-hand combat erupted in trenches carved hastily from the earth. Serbian artillery, improving in accuracy, began to counter Bulgarian bombardments. Each day, Bulgarian units suffered mounting losses while gaining little ground. The plan for a lightning offensive had stalled in the mud, fire, and blood of Bregalnitsa. Then came the turning point. Serbian forces launched a massive counteroffensive, striking the flanks of the Bulgarian Fourth Army. Caught off balance, the Bulgarians struggled to regroup. In a devastating blow to Bulgarian morale, the entire Bulgarian 7th Division, thousands of men, was surrounded and captured. It was a symbolic and strategic disaster. What began as a confident advance now spiraled into a chaotic retreat. For the Bulgarian High Command, the collapse at Bregalnitsa was more than a battlefield setback. It shattered the illusion of superiority. The Serbs had not only held the line, they had outmaneuvered and outfought the very army that once crushed Ottoman defenses. Bulgaria's hopes for a quick victory dissolved. Their central position in Macedonia was now threatened, and the initiative had firmly passed into Serbian hands. The Battle of Bregalnitsa was the largest and bloodiest engagement of the Second Balkan War. It marked the moment when Bulgaria's offensive dreams died and Serbia emerged as a force that could not be ignored. And as Bulgarian troops withdrew eastward, exhausted and broken, the Balkans braced for the next phase of the war, one that would bring new enemies, new fronts, and new disasters. While Bulgarian forces bled at Bregalnitsa, a second storm was gathering in the south. Greece, already secure in Thessaloniki, now faced the Bulgarian Second Army along a tense front stretching across rugged hills and fortified positions. Bulgarian leadership hoped that a rapid strike could seize the city and force Greece into retreat. But their plans unraveled the moment King Constantine I ordered his troops to launch a full-scale counterattack. What followed would become one of the most intense battles Greece had ever fought. At Kilkis-Lachanas, Greek and Bulgarian forces collided in a furnace of artillery fire, bayonet charges, and close-quarters combat. The Greeks were outgunned, with Bulgarian artillery dominating the high ground. Yet Greek morale was unshakable. Their soldiers fought with a mixture of national pride, recent battlefield success, and the determination to protect Thessaloniki at any cost. King Constantine, personally overseeing operations, pushed his commanders to maintain relentless pressure. The first day was catastrophic for both sides. Bulgarian positions inflicted heavy casualties, forcing Greek units to regroup repeatedly. But unlike the Ottomans months earlier, the Greeks adapted quickly. They shifted artillery batteries, secured flanking hills, and coordinated infantry assaults with renewed precision. By the second day, the momentum began to tilt. Bulgarian troops, stretched thin and still recovering from earlier battles, found themselves unable to contain the growing Greek advance. On the third day, the tide fully broke. Greek forces surged forward in a sweeping assault, overrunning Bulgarian trenches and capturing key fortifications. The fighting was desperate. Bayonets clashed, ammunition ran short, and entire battalions dissolved under the pressure. Bulgarian officers attempted to hold their lines, but the cumulative toll of exhaustion, poor supply, and miscommunication proved too much. their army began a steady retreat northward. The fall of Kilkis-Lachanas was a humiliation Bulgaria could not ignore. It shattered the illusion of dominance in the south and exposed massive vulnerabilities in Bulgaria's strategic planning. The Greek army, once underestimated, had demonstrated that it was no longer a secondary player in the Balkans. Their victory allowed Greek forces to link up with Serbian units in the north, creating a united front that boxed Bulgaria into an increasingly narrow corridor. With the Greeks advancing and the Serbs counterattacking, Bulgaria now faced a two-sided disaster. The Second Bulgarian army, once expected to seize Thessaloniki, was pushed back into defensive chaos, and King Constantine, emboldened by victory, made a bold decision. He ordered his army to march north into Bulgaria itself. His ambition was audacious. If he could take Sofia, he believed, he could end the war on Greek terms. What followed would draw the Greeks into one of the most dangerous landscapes in the Balkans, and into the jaws of a Bulgarian counterattack that nearly changed the course of the war. The road to Sofia cut through one of the most deceptive landscapes in the Balkans, the Kresna Gorge. To King Constantine and the Greek high command, this narrow corridor looked like the final gateway to victory. Bulgarian forces were retreating, morale seemed broken, and the momentum of the war appeared firmly in Greek hands. If the Greeks could push through the gorge, they believed, the Bulgarian capital might fall within days. It was a vision too tempting to resist. But the Kresna Gorge was not merely a passage. It was a trap sculpted by nature itself. Towering cliffs, steep ravines, and twisting paths created a perfect battlefield for ambushes. Bulgarian commanders, recognizing the terrain's defensive potential, pulled their forces back deliberately, masking strength behind the illusion of retreat. While the Greeks advanced deeper into the narrowing valley, Bulgaria quietly repositioned the Second and Fourth Armies for a counterstrike that would define their survival. As Greek columns entered the gorge, they found themselves stretched thin along the winding road. Supply lines lengthened, communication faltered, and units struggled to maintain formation in the choking heat and rugged terrain. For a brief moment, Greek officers believed Bulgaria was simply collapsing. But by the time they realized the truth, it was too late. Bulgarian artillery, hidden along the cliffs, opened fire with devastating precision. The ambush unfolded with brutal speed. Bulgarian infantry surged from concealed positions, attacking the flanks of the Greek advance. Rifles cracked from ridgelines that the Greeks had assumed were empty. Entire battalions found themselves cut off as Bulgarian troops maneuvered behind them. The hunters had become the hunted. Greek commanders, shocked by the sudden reversal, scrambled to prevent what looked like the beginnings of a massive encirclement. For Bulgaria, this was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a moment of national defiance. Soldiers who had retreated only days earlier now fought with renewed fury, determined to prove that their nation was not yet defeated. Their counterattack carved a wedge between Greek units, threatening to isolate and destroy a large portion of the invading army. Panic flickered through the Greek ranks as the vision of taking Sofia dissolved into a desperate struggle for survival. Yet the Greeks held on. King Constantine's officers rallied their men, stabilizing collapsing lines and organizing defensive pockets to prevent a full encirclement. The battle raged for days in the suffocating July heat. Cliffs echoed with artillery strikes, and the narrow valley became a maze of smoke, dust, and chaos. Each side suffered heavy casualties, and neither could deliver the decisive blow. In the end, the Kresna Gorge became the turning point, not because one side destroyed the other, but because both sides realized the cost of continuing. For Greece, the dream of marching to Sofia had died in the narrow walls of the gorge. For Bulgaria, the counterattack proved that they were still capable of defending their homeland, but it also revealed how overstretched and isolated they had become. The battle ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. By the time the guns fell silent, the truth was undeniable. Bulgaria could still fight, but it could no longer win. And while soldiers on both sides caught their breath among the rocks and rivers of the gorge, new dangers were already closing in from every horizon. The war was about to expand beyond anything the Balkans had seen before. Even as Bulgaria fought desperately in the Kresna Gorge, two new storms were forming on its borders. Storms that would make the war unwinnable. The first came from the north. Romania, which had remained neutral during the First Balkan War, now saw an opportunity too good to ignore. Southern Dobruja, a fertile and strategically valuable region, lay just across the Danube. For years, Bucharest had claimed it as historically Romanian and ethnically mixed. With Bulgaria exhausted and isolated, the moment to strike had finally arrived. On July 10, 1913, Romania declared war. There was no grand battle, no dramatic clash of armies. Instead, Romanian troops marched across the Danube, almost unopposed. Bulgarian forces were tied down in Macedonia, unable to redeploy fast enough. Within days, Romanian cavalry fanned out across the countryside, seizing towns and railways with hardly a shot fired. By July 20th, they were just 116 kilometers north of Sofia. It was a humiliating sight. The capital city of a once triumphant Balkan power, now threatened by an army that had not even been part of the fighting. Romania then delivered a symbolic blow that echoed across Europe, the first aerial operation in its military history. A Romanian aircraft flew over Sofia and dropped leaflets, not bombs. These papers warned Bulgaria to surrender or be invaded. For the Bulgarian public, it was a chilling message. Their enemies could reach even the safety of the capital. But the irony was even darker. Romania suffered almost no combat casualties. Instead, they faced an invisible killer lurking in their own ranks. Cholera erupted within the Romanian army, spreading rapidly in the July heat. Soldiers collapsed along roads, rivers, and camps. Over 1,600 Romanians died, not from bullets or bayonets, but from disease. And as troops moved across the Balkans, the epidemic spread to Bulgarian, Greek, and Serbian lines, killing thousands more than the battles themselves. It was a grim reminder that war rarely chooses its victims. Often, it devours them indiscriminately. While Bulgaria reeled from the Romanian advance, another threat emerged from the east, the Ottoman Empire. Humiliated by the loss of Thrace and Adrianople in the First Balkan War, the Ottomans had watched Bulgaria's collapse with growing determination. Under the command of Enver Pasha, Ottoman forces crossed the Maritsa River and marched into eastern Thrace. Unlike the previous year, there was no titanic struggle. Bulgarian troops had already been withdrawn or weakened. The Ottomans retook Adrianople, Edirne, without resistance, but their return was not peaceful. Ottoman authorities expelled nearly the entire Bulgarian population from eastern Thrace, a massive and traumatic displacement. For the Bulgarians, this was not merely a territorial loss, it was an open wound, a painful reversal of hard-won victories. The message was unmistakable. Bulgaria was now being carved apart from every direction. Within weeks, Bulgaria found itself encircled by 4 enemy states: Serbia, Greece, Romania, and the Ottomans. Its lines were stretched thin, its soldiers exhausted, its people demoralized. The cholera epidemic only deepened the catastrophe. Even Bulgaria's impressive artillery and battlefield experience could not compensate for political isolation and a collapsing strategic position. By late July, it was clear to everyone, from the trenches to the royal palace, that Bulgaria could not continue the fight. The dream of a greater Bulgaria had dissolved under the pressure of 4 invading armies and the returning shadow of the Ottoman Empire. Now, all that remained was to determine how much Bulgaria would lose and how the Balkans would reshape themselves once more. By the end of July 1913, the crisis had reached its breaking point. Bulgarian soldiers, once hailed as the finest fighting force in the Balkans, were exhausted, starving, and fighting on 4 collapsing fronts. The dream of a quick and decisive war had vanished. What remained was a desperate struggle to prevent the total destruction of the country. Villagers fled burning border towns, wounded men filled makeshift hospitals, and the government in Sofia realized that each passing day made the terms of peace worse. Bulgaria was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for survival. Diplomatically, Bulgaria stood alone. Russia, once its protector, had been alienated by its aggression against Serbia. Austria-Hungary, hoping to weaken Serbia, refused to intervene. Germany and France had no interest in risking a wider conflict. Meanwhile, the Balkan states that had been allies just months earlier now treated Bulgaria as the aggressor that needed to be punished. Surrounded and isolated, Sofia sent out urgent messages requesting mediation, but the replies were dismissive. Everyone could see the direction of the war, except perhaps Tsar Ferdinand himself. The armies pushing toward Sofia were the final confirmation. From the north, Romanians advanced with almost no resistance. From the south, Greek troops pushed through the mountains. From the west, the Serbs continued their offensive, capturing cities and rail hubs that Bulgaria had fought hard to secure the previous year. And from the east, the Ottomans, returning like a resurgent ghost, now stood once more before the gates of Adrianople. It was the perfect storm, and Bulgaria had nowhere to run. On August 10, 1913, the inevitable happened. The Treaty of Bucharest was signed, ending the Second Balkan War. Its terms redrew the map of the Balkans once again, but this time at Bulgaria's expense. Romania received southern Dobruja, the rich agricultural region it had coveted for years. Serbia claimed the lion's share of Vardar Macedonia, nearly doubling its territory and transforming itself into the dominant Slavic power of the peninsula. Greece secured Thessaloniki and the Aegean coastline, ensuring a strategic position that would shape its future for decades. For the Ottomans, the treaty was bittersweet. They were not invited to Bucharest, an insult they did not fail to notice, but their success came later that month, when they signed the Treaty of Constantinople with Bulgaria. In that agreement, the Ottomans regained eastern Thrace, including Adrianople. The city they had lost in humiliation was now returned without a fight, restoring their pride and establishing a new border that would last into the modern era. Bulgaria's gains were meager. It retained a narrow outlet to the Aegean Sea and a smaller portion of Macedonia, but these were shadows compared to what it had hoped for. The nation that had emerged triumphant in 1912 now stood wounded, embittered, and humiliated. The Second Balkan War had lasted barely a month, yet in that short time, Bulgaria had lost prestige, territory, and tens of thousands of lives. The psychological blow was even worse. A profound sense of injustice, known in Bulgarian memory as the Second National Catastrophe, settled over the nation like a dark fog. In the capitals of Europe, diplomats noted the end of the war with relief, but they also recognized the danger it created. Serbia now stood stronger than ever. Bulgaria now nursed resentment and a desire to reclaim what it had lost. Greece expanded its influence. Romania gained territory but faced new ethnic tensions, and the Ottoman Empire, humiliated but still alive, began looking for new allies. Peace had returned to the Balkans, but it was a peace stitched together with anger, ambition, and unresolved grievances. The Treaty of Bucharest was not a conclusion, it was a warning. Beneath the fragile calm, the powder keg of Europe had been packed tighter than ever, waiting for the spark that would come from Sarajevo the following year. The Balkans in the summer of 1913 looked, on the surface, like a region that had finally exhausted itself. The guns fell silent, treaties were signed, and borders were redrawn once more. But beneath this thin veneer of peace, the Second Balkan War had carved deep scars into every nation involved. None of the victors were satisfied, none of the losers were reconciled, and none of the great powers understood that they were now walking toward the greatest catastrophe in modern history. The war had ended, but the consequences were only beginning. For Bulgaria, the war left behind a national trauma so profound it reshaped politics for a generation. The dream of a greater Bulgaria had collapsed in a matter of weeks, and the bitterness of defeat fermented into a desire for revenge. Politicians and military officers blamed each other. Newspapers railed against the treachery of neighboring states. Young Bulgarians grew up hearing stories of a stolen Macedonia and a betrayed nation. This anger would not remain confined within Bulgaria's borders. It would soon guide the country toward the Central Powers in World War I, hoping German and Austro-Hungarian victory could undo the humiliation. Meanwhile, Serbia emerged from the war transformed. It had doubled in size and now stood as the dominant Slavic nation in the Balkans. But this new strength terrified Austria-Hungary. Vienna saw in Serbia not just a rising power, but a mortal threat to its multi-ethnic empire. Inside Austria-Hungary, millions of Slavs looked south toward Serbia with admiration. To the Habsburgs, this was a nightmare. Each Serbian victory, first against the Ottomans, then the Bulgarians, made the empire more anxious. Serbia's ambitions and Austria-Hungary's paranoia created a political tension that no treaty could calm. Even as diplomats celebrated the new map of the Balkans, generals in Vienna were already discussing how to contain or crush Serbia before it grew any stronger. The idea that a regional conflict could trigger a wider war no longer seemed unthinkable. It felt unavoidable. Greece and Romania also emerged strengthened, but even their victories carried hidden dangers. Expansion brought new borders to defend, new minorities to rule, and new rivalries to manage. The region had not been stabilized, it had been rearranged in a way that ensured future conflict. Ethnic tensions deepened. Nationalist groups across the peninsula, from Croats to Macedonians to Albanians, believed their turn for independence had come. The peace of 1913 was a breeding ground for future insurgencies. The great powers, watching from afar, misread the entire situation. Russia believed Serbia could be guided as a loyal client state. Austria-Hungary believed Serbia could be intimidated into submission. Germany believed it could support Austria without ever provoking a general war. France believed its alliance system would deter aggression, and Britain believed diplomacy could prevent escalation. Every major power saw what it wanted to see. Not one understood what the Balkans had become. Because after 2 consecutive wars, the region was no longer the unstable corner of Europe. It was the ignited center of continental politics. Every border redrawn created 2 new grievances. Every victory created a future enemy. Every humiliation created a desire for revenge. And every nation, whether Slavic, Greek, Romanian, or Turkish, believed history was on their side. By the end of 1913, the Balkans had earned a new name among diplomats, the powder keg of Europe. All it needed was a spark. And on a quiet June morning in Sarajevo the following year, a young man stepped out of a crowd with a pistol, pulling the trigger not just on an archduke, but on everything the Second Balkan War had left behind. The fuse that led to World War I had been primed here, among the mountains, rivers, and rivalries of the Balkans, and once lit, it would engulf the entire world.